Bienvenidos un domingo más a Lugar Correcto. Mi nombre es Alguna. Soy neuropsicóloga y tengo el grandísimo honor de ser la host de este espacio. La conversación del día de hoy está específicamente dirigida a todo aquel o a toda aquella que cree que su tristeza, su depresión o hasta esta desconexión que siente consigo mismo no es justificable, porque nunca ha experimentado nada aparentemente grave. El día de hoy me acompaña Ruth Cohn, una experta en el campo del trauma de la negligencia. Ruth ha dedicado su vida a entender y a investigar cómo es que el desarrollo del infante puede llegar a dejar heridas invisibles. Con su vasto conocimiento y su enfoque profundamente humanista, Ruth nos guía a través de cómo estas heridas invisibles impactan no solo la manera en la que nosotros nos vemos a nosotros mismos, sino cómo nos relacionamos con los demás y, más importante, en cómo vemos el mundo. Nos comparte historias, reflexiones y herramientas para poder entender y validar nuestras propias emociones, aun cuando el origen de esas emociones aparentemente no existe. Lo que sí es que tengo una advertencia. Este episodio puede llegar a evocar emociones muy profundas de tristeza al reflexionar sobre la profundidad de estas heridas. Te invito a que cuides muchísimo de ti, que vayas a tu ritmo, a tu tiempo y a tu espacio. Que pauses el episodio si necesitas pausarlo y que lo escuches en secciones. Pero más importante, porque me gustaría acompañarte en este proceso, te voy a dejar un link a unos ejercicios de respiración para regular tu sistema nervioso que van a estar disponibles de manera gratuita en mi Patreon. Si alguna vez has sentido que no tienes derecho a sentirte mal porque tu vida está llena de privilegio y aparentemente es buena, esta conversación te hará cuestionar esas creencias y te abrirá una puerta hacia la empatía a ti mismo. Y si es posible, va a sembrar las semillas del inicio de este proceso de regreso a ti. Esta es una charla que impactó mi alma con una de las voces más respetadas en este ámbito del trauma. Espero que la disfrutes tanto como yo. También te aviso que esta entrevista es en inglés, entonces ténganme paciencia porque no es mi lenguaje nativo. Y que si lo quieres escuchar con subtítulos, te metas a YouTube, las personas que me están escuchando en Spotify, pero que te metas a YouTube para que la puedas ver en una tele, en tu celular, en tu computadora, con subtítulos, porque creo que es muy importante escucharla de manera pausada para poder entender todo el conocimiento que Ruth nos quiere transmitir. Asimismo, te voy a dejar en la cajita todos los recursos que Ruth ha expuesto de manera gratuita para que te puedas ir familiarizando con su trabajo y puedas leer su newsletter y todos los blogs y todo lo nuevo que está haciendo, porque es una mujer que ha cambiado el campo. A Ruth le doy muchísimas gracias por regalarme su tiempo, y a ti te doy muchísimas las gracias por estar aquí y por presentarte aquí, a regresar a ti y a conocerte un poquito mejor. Pero sin más que decir, te dejo con el episodio y nos vemos el próximo domingo.
Okay, it's already recording, but I am so happy that we made it happen, Ruth. I've been chasing you down for a couple of months since I heard one of your talks you gave on trauma of neglect. So it's definitely been life-changing to hear you talk about these topics, and I hope my audience can benefit as much as I did from listening to you talk. How are you doing today, Ruth?
I'm doing okay. I have a little cold, so my voice is not great, but it doesn't hurt. It's not hard. It's just a little bit lower than it usually is. But other than that, I'm okay.
Other than that, you're okay. Well, I'm really glad you're here. And to start things off, we're going to talk about the trauma of neglect and why sometimes, even though you have had everything in life as an individual, you might still feel that something is off, or that your depression or your sadness or your pain is not justifiable. And the first time that I heard you talk about this topic, it was really eye-opening because you were talking it from a different angle. And you were acknowledging, like, I think some people don't know they have permission to feel sad, or that their sadness is justifiable. And I truly believe that nobody ever teaches something that they have not either experienced themselves directly or indirectly. So I would love to introduce the topic by you talking a little bit about yourself and talking about how you beginning to engage with the topic of neglect, and whether there was in a specific moment where you realized, oh my God, I have experienced this myself, or Yes, so if we could start with that, I think that would be.
Okay, Cynthia.
Um,
Well, there's a lot of story here, and I'm a storyteller, so thank you. And they're really good questions. Because the thing about neglect is there's nothing to get interested in. So, how did I get interested in nothing? That's the question. So, I'll tell you how it happened. And I'm an old lady. I started working in this field of trauma in the late 1980s. You and many of your listeners were not born yet, but we got the PTSD diagnosis in 1980. So in the 80s, the world started to become aware of violence against women and children. And before that, there was a lot of ignorance about it. In fact, in the US, the number one medical school text that all the doctors in training had to read said that the cases of incest, of sexual abuse in the family, was 1 per million. That's what all the doctors were learning in medical school. And then in the 1980s, we got the women, or in the late 70s, we got the women's movement, and we had all this interest in violence against women and children, and all these sexual abuse survivors and incest survivors started coming out of the woodwork. And so my practice, when I first started practicing in 1988, was mostly women who had histories of childhood sexual abuse and incident trauma, meaning they either came to remember or they always remembered that something really terrible and overwhelming had happened to them. So I started working with sexual abuse, and lots of the women who were in my practice, and it was pretty much only adult women at that time, had partners. And many of them had male partners who they complained about, who didn't get it, who didn't understand, who didn't support them enough, who wanted to have sex with them, who didn't understand that they couldn't have sex or they didn't want to. So I started hearing these stories so much that I thought, well, here's an idea. I will offer one-day workshops for male partners of women who were sexually abused as children. So I offered my workshop. In those days, we didn't have internet, so I had to make a paper flyer and put a stamp on it and put it in the mail and mail it in the mailbox and wait. And I got a good response, and there were 8 men in my little psychotherapy office with me. So picture that, a little room with 8 men and me. So, and they're coming for a whole day. So, as we will do in any one-day gathering of, of psychotherapy participants of some kind, we go around and introduce ourselves. So I said, so tell us something about yourself. So they went around the circle, and each person, without exception, responded by talking about their wife. And I thought, how interesting. I ask you about you, and you respond by talking about someone else. What is that? And then they started talking about their relationship, and I'd heard all about it from the other side, from the complaining survivor side. And here were these men, and they were paying the therapy bills, and they were taking care of kids, and they were shopping, and they were cooking, and they were paying housekeepers, and they were not having sex with their partner, and they were basically kind of tolerating what we all know. And I'm a survivor myself, so the nature of trauma is to fixate on the trauma. The person in the throes of trauma recovery is going to be very self-concerned. So these women were very absorbed in their therapy, and these partners were very devoted to supporting them, taking care of them, and not really getting much back. So I started to wonder what kind of childhood would prepare someone to tolerate getting so little back, especially over a long period of time. And so I asked them, well, what happened to you? What's your story? And this is a signature of neglect. It was without exception. And there's a shrug that goes with it that sort of looks like this. And they said, nothing happened to me. And I thought, nothing. That's the problem. Because a lot of things are supposed to happen and they didn't happen. And so these people built a whole character, a whole personality structure, a whole relationship pattern built on this experience starting very, very, very early of nothing. There's nobody there. Now, going back to your question, Cynthia, why do I feel bad when I have nothing to point to? Well, it's very hard to know why I feel bad if it's about missing experiences. And when we're talking about what's missing, we're talking about what is not there. We're talking about what we cannot see. So to be upset about something that isn't there or something we cannot see, it sounds crazy to people. Like, what's the matter with you? You're upset about something that isn't there? And the fact is, there's so much that's supposed to be there that wasn't there. And I'll say one last thing, and then I'm going to stop and give you some space to interact. But the entire sense of self begins in that very, very early experience of attachment with the primary caregiver, which is long before we have the machinery to remember story, to create narrative, to create an autobiography. The brain does not have that equipment developed yet. So it takes, till we're in our mid-20s before our brain is more or less fully developed. And so you take an infant who is most vulnerable, who is most dependent, who is most in need of the attachment to the primary other, the primary caregiver, which in most cases is the mother because the infant grows in the mother's body. When that person is uncertain or withdraws or is absent or is angry or is scared or is blank or simply there is no one, that child experiences that as being lethal terror, because attachment, that primary attachment, is a survival need. We need that attachment to the mother the way we need food, water, oxygen, warmth, shelter, safety, all of those things. Probably the attachment is primary because we generally get all the other things from the attachment. So when the attachment is in question, the infant literally feels like they're going to die. But I'm going to hold here and give you some time, Cynthia, to either respond or ask more questions or to check with you if I'm on track.
Yes, you are on track, but just so that we can wrap that, what you just said, it's when you would ask people questions about them, they would respond with their wives, um, stuff about their wives. So it's as if one way in which we know that there was trauma of neglect would be when a person neglects themselves or doesn't even know that they can answer or that they are allowed to answer something about themselves. Am I reading that correctly?
Yes. Yes, indeed, Cynthia. Great question. And the experience of neglect is there is no me. And I'll tell you a story about my own dad. My dad had a lot of trauma. My dad was a survivor of the Nazi Holocaust. And I had this experience when my mother died in 2001. Backstory. My father was in an autobiography writing group for 5 years, and he went to that group every month, and they would write about their lives and about themselves, and they would read to the group. So the people in the group and the group leader knew each other very well. And so when my mother died, my father gave my sisters and me each a list of people to call to tell them that my mother had died. And one of the people on my list was the writing teacher. So I call this woman and I say, "Hi, my name is Ruth Cohn. I'm the daughter of Hans Cohn. He asked me to call you." And she said, "Oh," she said, "I didn't know he had a daughter." And I said, "He has three." My experience was there is no me. And you know what? There really wasn't. There's so much of an experience of I don't exist, or do I exist, or do I deserve to exist, or what do I have to do to earn my existence or to make up for my sorry existence? Because a child is self-referential. A child thinks if there's something I'm not getting, it's because I did something wrong. So there's this default to shame. Like if my dad doesn't like me, it means I'm bad or stupid or I shouldn't exist or I'm a blight on the planet or whatever it is. So it becomes my shame if he doesn't see me. And the core missing experience of neglect, and this is a really important takeaway, is the child is not seen, the child is not heard. It's almost like their existence doesn't register. Here in San Francisco, where I live, there's this whole new wave of, maybe you've heard of this, it's really kind of spooky, driverless cars. And you see these cars go by where there's nobody driving, and it's almost like there's a ghost in the driver's seat. It's very strange. But I think the reason why I'm so averse to those is because it reminds me of that whole question of existence, which is a question that is built into the neglect experience. There is no me, so probably I'm so worthless that I have no right to exist, or maybe I don't exist.
That does definitely hit home a little bit, and not because of me, but I'm pretty sure my mom is quite vocal of her experience. But what you just said about when you called and I didn't know he had a daughter, it reminds me of a story with my mom that she tells, and I think nobody ever has been able to acknowledge her pain. She was her mom has had some problems. She was an alcoholic, and dad was left the world when she was like about 10 years old. And she was looking for her dad. So she had an address of one of his brothers. So she was looking for his dad all over the place. And she went and knocked at the door of his brother because whenever she got into trouble, she was like, he's going to help me because my mom isn't showing up for me as she should. And She went and was trying to find answers, as once was trying to find a place to go. And she opened the door, like he opens the door, the uncle, and says, "Oh, you're the detail." She was she was product of an extramarital relationship. And she said, "You are the detail." And to this day, my mom has those words printed upon her soul.
Oh, God.
And when you said that, it truly reminded me.
You have no right to exist.
Yeah, that's the translation.
What a terrible story. What a terrible story. Wow. Wow.
So,
and
those are the extreme cases. That's how she found out. Yeah.
Is that how your mother found out about her history?
Yeah. That's how she found out.
That is so sad. So sad.
It's
What I
extremely
wanted
sad,
to
and I don't think
add
her
about
pain has ever been acknowledged.
oh,
Because I think it's so hard to see, but I'm sorry.
yeah. Oh, it's so sad. And you know what you named, Cynthia, and this is a really good point, is there's so much shame. And then on top of the shame is shame about the shame. Like, oh, I have no right to exist, but, what a piece of garbage I am for thinking that. So it's like layer upon layer.
And I think those are the extreme cases where neglect is observable, where they're actually neglecting someone. And what is a 11-year-old having to do on the street looking for answers because mom isn't home and she doesn't show up and dad is not in the world anymore? And those are the extreme cases of neglect. And it has definitely left immense marks upon a lot of us that came after her. And on her,
yes.
I'm pretty sure. But when we talk about the attachment that you were initially talking about, just to make it a little bit, maybe understanding a bit better, is those cases are extreme, but they can also be neglect where mom is busy, dad is busy, or mom is unregulated. Mom maybe is all over the place, feeling unsafe in her own body. And then dad is extremely busy. And then children are sensitive. Children are sensitive whenever they are experiencing grief for the loss of one of their toys, and they're not validated by that experience, or like, I see your pain. That is another way in which they can maybe interpret, I'm not here, I don't exist. If my pain doesn't exist, if nobody sees what I'm trying to say, then I don't exist. And those would be the less extreme cases of
that's true. And
neglect.
Cynthia, what I do want to add, that the core of this experience is a time that no one remembers. And when a baby is born, an infant, they need everything. And so the mother who is present, she learns to recognize when the baby cries, oh, that one is hunger, that one is cold, that one is fear, that one is I need a hug, that one is I'm bored, that one is I'm tired. And so the mother, if she's attuned to this newborn infant, she hears the cry, she responds to the infant with the proper supplies, and then the infant is satisfied and calms down. So, say a hungry infant, their nervous system goes into an aroused state. They cry, they might flail, they might reach for, some food. And if the mother comes, and she comes promptly, and she provides the supply that's needed, the child not only calms down because it's nourished, but it has the experience, oh, I have value. And this is long before we have cognition. It's a sensory It's a somatic, it's an emotional, it's an experience that takes place in this organism of an infant just born, newborn, 0 to 6 months. So, what happens when nobody comes? The baby cries, cries, cries. The hunger is really painful. Nobody comes. Then they just collapse. And so, if the infant cries and nobody comes, if the infant reaches and nobody comes, first of all, they feel like they're going to die because the attachment is a survival need. But second of all, they collapse. They freeze. They stop crying. They stop reaching. That child kind of often goes into the freeze response, which is associated with numbing out, which is associated with attentional problems because the brain is understimulated because there's nobody there. And so that child will grow up with the sense that I'm not seen and I'm not heard, but they have no idea why. Because this happened long, long, long before they had any cognition, long before they had any autobiography. So you take a mother who has postpartum depression or marital problems or her own trauma history like my mother, or she's simply not there. She's busy or she's tired or she's sick or she's, having an affair with somebody else, or she never wanted that baby in the first place, but she's not responding. That child, that infant, doesn't have an explanation for that except for I'm not worth it. So that's the experience they internalize. I do want to say one more thing about the infant, which is really important. And this is another really important takeaway from my work that I want your people to learn and to understand. And it's called the dilemma without solution. And this is what makes relationship so challenging for people with neglect history. And here's the dilemma without solution. The dilemma is the following. The child needs and longs for the mother or that primary caregiving other more than anyone else in the world. That is the beloved other. And that same person who withdraws or is absent or is erratic or is angry or is scared or is not there at all, that is what evokes the survival terror. So, in effect, the source of longing and the source of terror is the same person. So, the child is reaching for her and trying to get away and get safe and reaching for and pulling away and reaching for and pulling away, and they can't resolve it because they feel both so intensely. They feel the longing and they feel like they're going to die. So they're that scared. And so ultimately they collapse and they freeze. And they stop crying, and they stop reaching. And when that child gets older, most kids, and this is where I began to learn about myself, most kids with these histories, which we of course don't remember, and we don't remember except for that we feel worthless, and we feel like we don't exist, and we feel, and this is a phrase in English that I heard so much that it really started to register. I don't matter. I don't matter. And So the child grows up thinking like, I don't matter to anybody else. So I can't count on anyone for anything. So I have to do it all myself. So that child, and I'm a perfect example, learns at a very early age, just like your mother did the way you told that story. You do it all yourself because there is no one else. There's nowhere to turn. There's no one to ask. There's no one to reach for. There's no one to rely on. So it's me. And in Western culture, certainly in the US, we idealize self reliance. Independence is supposed to be a good thing. So it goes invisible, and people who are self-reliant are kind of thought, oh, she's a hero. She, starts earning her own money when she's 12 years old and she pays for her own college and all that stuff. And so I get my sort of kudos that way, but there's no one there. And I never learn about how to have a relationship that's reciprocal.
And to undo that, it's a lifelong kind of process in which also you have relied so much on yourself that you do not know whether relying on others is trustworthy and whether the ground is solid enough for you to put the food on front. And those are the kind of repercussions we see. In the 2024 conference of trauma that you did in Oxford, you said, when you're not connected to others, nothing matters. How would you respond to those parents that think that providing material goods, like a solid roof, clothing, schooling, is enough, yet they overlook this emotional presence and physical presence of connectedness through the eyesight, through the emotional experience that you have with a child? That is the most important thing for developing a sense of self. And how could we explain that the impacts that are left on someone that didn't have that emotional companionship, through their experiences while they were developing, or that eyesight, that emotional eyesight, and it says, I see you, leaves impacts from a disconnection to self and obviously security. You don't trust the world. How could we explain that it's not enough to have school, a roof over your body, and maybe some clothes on your body and toys?
Great question, Cynthia. And I think there are two parts to it because I have to admit that I have never seen a successful case of a client trying to explain that to the parents. Generally speaking, the parents are repeating their own experience, so they don't get it, and they probably will be very defensive about it. So our best hope is to be able to explain it to our clients and ourselves. And that's where, and your neuroscience background is so important, because so much of this can be explained by the science and by the brain, because we can see the brain develops, the brain of the infant develops in resonance. The resonance between the right hemisphere of the mother and the right hemisphere of the infant. And largely through the gazing, as you said, we get that resonance, that sense of give and take, of reciprocity. And when that's not there, when that's missing, then the infant brain, the very deepest primitive part of the brainstem, the periaqueductal gray, is understimulated. So, and that's where the sense of self begins, way back in the brainstem. So we have to talk to them about the brain and about the biology, because then they don't feel as much shame. And that also makes it something that we share not only with all other humans, but with all other mammals. And Sue Carter, who is one of my great women heroes, who has been studying attachment from a biological standpoint for 50 years. She's probably at least 80 now. She's a lovely woman, and I've always loved her work because she talks about sex and she talks about animals, and she really makes a lot of important connections about biology and about human development and personality and all that. And what Sue's research showed, which I think is so interesting, and it's really recent research, because when I spoke with her in Boston last May, it had not been published yet. It had been written but not published yet. And she said that she studied for many decades the prairie vole, and the prairie vole is a little rodent like a mouse. And the prairie vole, what's interesting about them is they mate for life, which is unusual for mammals to have one partner through their whole lives. And so she studies the prairie vole, and in the lab, they found that if the baby vole had one incident of disrupted attachment, just one, meaning the researcher took the infant out of the cage for 1 minute and then put it back. One incident, 1 minute, that prairie vole, that baby vole, his DNA was changed for life. So what I'm saying is these attachment injuries are no joke. They are for real. And so even though they may have had all the creature comforts, these early experiences of nothing or these early missing experiences are hugely significant. And one other thing that I think is really, really important, certainly in this country, and that is that as I said, the brain develops in resonance between the mother's brain and the infant brain. When the mother isn't there, or she's not present, or she's sometimes there and sometimes not, so the brain is understimulated, that brain will be what we call under aroused. That brain fires too slow. And, it's interesting. It's kind of ironic because I always associated attentional problems, ADD and ADHD, attention deficit and attention hyperactivity deficit, as being a speeded up brain, but it's the opposite. It's the brain is too slow, which is why they treat it with amphetamine drugs like Adderall and, those speed type drugs. And I shudder to think, because how many kids, certainly in the US, get slapped with an ADD, ADHD diagnosis, get a prescription for amphetamines, and are on speed at an early age. I don't know what it means to have a generation of kids growing up on speed, but the brain is altered by being understimulated, and the kids have trouble concentrating, trouble paying attention, trouble waiting, and the kinds of things that we see in the survivor of neglect. They don't have patience because they've been left alone too much, and so the system is scared and the brain is understimulated.
Understood. That's a fascinating way to look at it, that ADHD, it's actually the reverse of what it's being said, that it's an overstimulation and hyperactive disorder.
Yeah.
Because I've heard another theory about ADHD being the product of the necessity to zoom out. You go to outer space with your mind. So you zoom out because being in the environment, it's unbearable. So you zoom out. And I've definitely been
Mm,
a victim of magical thinking and zooming
mm,
out but that would make perfect sense because you live in like this hyperactive world where everything is fragmented, and it's due to the lack of arousal in those primary regions in the brain. But have you ever heard about that zoom out theory?
I haven't, but it's interesting and it makes sense because, the child of neglect who has, I always like to use the sort of the metaphor or the image of an astronaut sort of floating in space with no tether because the child feels
Mm.
so disconnected. So the need to flee makes a lot of sense, to just get away from the agony and the pain, which is why, I mean, zooming out is one solution. And you see a lot of escapist activity, whether it be drugs or some other mood altering mechanism, whether it be food or alcohol or activities that are very distracting, um, to take a person out of their experience, which is empty, and the emptiness is unbearable, unbearable.
One of those behaviors, I don't know if you heard about the term limerence, whereas when you have like this sense of infatuation of being in love with another person, you know, that you're so passionate and so overly in love and you cannot really focus at anything but that other person. Would you say that that's also another way of leaving the body because it feels empty inside and projecting into that desire to being loved by another one so intensely?
That's a good question, and oh, I have so much to say about relationship and sexuality because if you take the dilemma without solution, where the source of comfort and the source of terror is the same person, that becomes the template, that becomes the pattern for relationship. So basically, the child of neglect is terrified to get very close. So they arrange, not consciously, but they end up arranging their relationships in such a way that they are not at risk for being in that dilemma where the source of longing will leave, and they will be in lethal danger again. So being in love with an imaginary person or having a fantasy relationship with somebody or having impossible, you know, obsessions with someone that is invariably going to, you know, push them away, it solves the problem because they can reach for without being at risk for the lethal terror of loss because they never get close enough. So I've got a whole model where I talk about neglect informed sex therapy, which has to do with how children of neglect orchestrate relationship to keep themselves safe and to never get really connected. But the problem is they stay very lonely, and it doesn't solve the problem because they keep trying and they keep losing. So they still keep getting hurt and, disappointed and devastated again. So they do collapse into that lethal danger again. But obsession with another, first of all, it's a flight from the kind of emptiness. It's a kind of zooming out, like you said, and it's also a way to imagine oneself in relationship without taking the risk.
Yeah, makes absolutely perfect sense. Um, and I was definitely a victim of that kind of fluctuation, obsession. But Moving on to another topic that you consistently touch upon, it's transgenerational transmission
Oh,
or intergenerational transmission. And this term sounds fascinating, but I think if we can maybe make this concept a little bit more graspable for the
sure.
normal audience, how could we explain and define in simple terms what intergenerational transmission is?
Great question. And it's very, very important to me. And this is something that I want all your people to hear, because the fact that they're here, the fact that you all are here, is really to your credit. It's basically a gift to the next generation, because we tend to perpetuate the experiences that we have not processed. And my parents both went through terrible things. And one way or another, it's not necessarily that we repeat precisely what was done to us, but whatever the imprinting is on of what was done to us is going to communicate itself to the next generation. For example, my mother, before she also was a Holocaust survivor, and she grew up in northern Germany, and she was in a pretty upper middle class family before the Nazis came. And her mother, my grandmother, who was a very kind of uppity intellectual, self-important, cold, distant northern German woman, was probably not there at all. And my sense is my mother was mostly raised by nannies. So my mother had no connection with other herself. So what did she know how to do? She knew how to do what her mother did, which was provide, food and sustenance and, a shelter and a roof over the head and clothes and discipline. And, we were supposed to believe that we had it all, especially because my parents lost everything. So we should be grateful for all that we have, because they suffered so much that, we have it pretty easy. So my mother's psyche was very impoverished. She didn't have warmth to communicate to me because she never got it. And there's a real myth that I can't love another unless I love myself. That's backwards. I can't love another until I've had the experience of feeling loved. And I would bet that my mother didn't, and she was separated from her parents at a very early age, and she was on a train and going off to England, and before she knew it, she didn't even know if she was going to ever see her parents again. So she was thrown into self-reliance when she was, 7 years old, sitting on a train going to England by herself. So yeah, she survived. She didn't burn up in the concentration camps, but she had a real deficit in terms of what she could give a child. The war ended in 1945. I was born in 1955. My mother had no recovery. She married my father. He was a survivor too. And here they were, these two really traumatized people. They didn't have it to give. They didn't have the attention. They had hyper aroused nervous systems. So, what kind of energy was she going to put through the gaze, if there was any gaze at all? Or if she was just, in those days, they would sort of prop a bottle up on the baby and leave the baby alone. And that was it. So, I mean, I don't know the details. I know from when I was 2 my parents had a restaurant, and my sister and I were sitting in the sink all day in their restaurant. So there was no attention for us because they were so busy surviving. And they were so busy surviving because they had no choice. So, how does the trauma get passed on through the generations? Well, we've got hyper aroused nervous systems. We've got people who are in high activation because they're still terrified because the trauma lives inside of them. Unprocessed trauma is not remembered, it's relived. So they're constantly with these, really wound up nervous systems, scared, anxious. And here they were in a foreign country, so they escaped to the US and still they didn't trust anybody because their home country, everyone turned against them. And before they knew it, all their people were getting killed. So who can you trust? So we have to hunker down. And so these scared people are communicating terror through the gaze, through the energy, through the field, all the ways that we communicate non-verbally, both with infants and then older kids. All of that is getting communicated. So what goes into that little child's body? Well, you guessed it. All this hyperarousal, all this fear, all this anxiety, mistrust. I mean, I grew up with the belief you can't trust anyone. You can't trust anyone because one day to the next they'll all turn against you. My mother used to say, you have to kiss everyone goodbye before you leave the house because you might not ever see them again. So that's what I grew up hearing from when I was a really little girl. So you grow up with this fear and mistrust inside. And, in the world now, there's so much trauma and neglect and war and famine and, terrible things going on every day that create more trauma, more neglect, more, all of it, racism, sexism, all this destruction that gets absorbed into the organism, and people don't know better than to communicate it in their relationship with their child, even what the child hears.
Yeah. Another, what I often hear, or the question that I get the most often is, why do I always gravitate to the same kind of partnership? And why do I always kind of find myself in situations where I'm not nourished and I stay because the attachment wins over my authenticity, and I erase myself in relationships? And they experience, hierarchies, they experience comparisons, they experience like this fear that I'll do anything that it takes to maintain the attachment with the partner that I choose. So one of the most like normal questions that I get is, why do I keep falling into, the same hell with a different devil? And that means, why do I have the same experience with multiple partners of being undertreated, being not nourished, being not seen love? And do you think that's another way of how the trauma is passed on, even though you might have been growing up in a household where mom and dad remained married, but there wasn't that affection, or they were like underlining subtle dynamics that were then translated and internalized, and then now you experience them as you grow up?
Great question. And I have a great interest in that. In fact, my first book was about that, about relationship. And here's how I answer that. And that is that we choose our partner with the old brain. So if you make a list of all the characteristics that you're looking for in a partner, and you find someone that checks all the boxes, you won't be attracted to them because the old brain meets a new person And suddenly there's this resonance like, oh, I've known you all my life. You make me feel the way I always felt. You make me feel like I always felt. Because in my old brain, I register not existing, not mattering, being, all the things that you said. That's my idea of love. That's familiar love. That's who I'm attracted to. And if I pick someone that checks all the boxes, I won't have any juice for them. I won't be attracted to them. They'll be, like, they're okay, but ugh, they don't turn me on. The one that turns me on, and for me, it was always like, give me Steve Jobs, someone who's really smart and really mean. That's how my dad was. Really smart and really mean. That's what would get to me. So here is the one piece of relationship advice that I ever give. And I only give one. I'm not an advice giver. I never give advice unless I'm asked to, except this. And you can put it on my tombstone. I always say that. There's one non-negotiable in mate selection. Just one. And take it from an old lady. I've been married 32 years. And I kissed a lot of frogs along the way. Here's the one piece of relationship advice that I will give. There's one non-negotiable in mate selection, just one. If you have this, you've got it made. If you don't have this, you will have nothing but trouble. Find someone who's willing and committed to work on the relationship with therapy if needed through the lifespan, and you'll be okay. If you have that, you can do anything, because we will choose someone who fits the model of what we associate with familiar love. We will choose someone with the best and worst traits, mostly the worst traits, of both our parents. And then we proceed to reconstellate our childhood with that person. So we both do it, both we and our partner. And these men that I talked about in the men's group, they were repeating what was done to them. They were choosing someone who made them feel like they didn't exist, because that's what they knew. That was familiar love to them. So we take as given. We choose someone who reminds us of the worst of our trauma. And then we begin to do the dance with that person, which is deadly. It's miserable. On my website, there's an article. It's the most downloaded item I've ever written. It's free. You can get a free download on my website. It's called Cycles of Escalation. And it's about this, how we choose a partner who exactly fits like hand in glove with our trauma and their trauma. It's a perfect match. And then we begin to do this dance, which has no end unless we get a good therapist, which is why I wrote the first book, because it's about all that. And that is what is most likely to bring the child of neglect into therapy. Because going back to your question, Cynthia, they, first of all, think nothing happened to them, which is true. Nothing happened. That's the problem. But also, the self-reliant character means they don't want to need us. They don't want to need the therapist. So they will come in saying, most therapists are useless. You won't have anything to offer me. I know more than you do. I mean, they're really, they know it all because they've had to construct an illusion of themselves as not needing anybody else. So they convince themselves of that. And of course, it's not true. And then they wind up being very lonely or sexually frustrated or, a whole lot of other problems that we may ultimately hear about. But we choose someone who evokes our childhood.
And on the note of the therapist, that is definitely true on my end. I approve of that. I remember that I thought that I was going to heal through yoga and, Wim Hof breathing techniques. And when I first went back to my therapist and I was a little older, I know her since I'm 7, but I went later on and I was like, what is she going to teach me? Like, this is like I had such a really superior kind of attitude in which I was like, one session was gone and I was like, this didn't bring me anything. I don't feel any better. And she's not telling me what to do. And now I would put a monument for her in my house because she's truly, you require a font heart for what you guys do, patience and divine love that I've never seen before, but that is a requirement to be able to accompany someone through the pain of reverting or creating new neuronal pathways to know that you deserve different and there is a way towards different.
And you're absolutely right, Cynthia. And for those of your people who are therapists, they will treat us, these clients, I certainly was one of them, will treat us very badly, and they will devalue us, and they will reject us, and they will leave. I've had people tell me I was ugly. I've had people tell me I don't know anything. I've had people, really be very cruel. And so we have to have a lot of support, good consultation. And, sometimes, and I work at home now, which is really a blessing. So sometimes at the end of my day, I go downstairs and I go to my husband, oh my God, I can't do this anymore. I just want to make bread. I just want to make cheese. I can't do this anymore. It's too hard. And there are days like that. We have to be prepared for that and take it as given. It comes with the job description. It's about that terror that they have about dependency and attachment. And I had it too. Took me many, many, many years, like you, Cynthia, to have the humility and the courage to receive the help.
Can we touch a little bit upon empathy and how, for the listeners that are about to embark in a therapeutic journey with another, like a companionship with a sacred heart like yours, how important is empathy, that the person feels as that the therapist is being empathetic towards their experiences when it comes to a child that has been neglected?
So important. The empathy is so important because when you think about it, what is empathy? Empathy is my capacity to see through your eyes, meaning I am stepping out of my own movie. I'm turning off my own reality and I'm entering yours, and I'm looking through your eyes and seeing from your point of view, which means you exist and you matter. Because if you didn't exist and if you didn't matter, I wouldn't bother visiting your world and trying to understand what goes on in there. I would just say, no, you're wrong. That's not how it is. My way is how it is. And that's how many, if not most, of our parents were. My mother used to say, and this is a quote, she used to say, "I'm the mother." And that meant there is no you, there is no reality other than mine. And so empathy is about seeing and hearing that the other has their own experience, and it has value, and it has meaning, and they matter. And that experience is so powerful to someone like you or someone like me who never felt like we existed in the eyes of the other or anyone. So, absolutely essential. And similarly, it's for many of them very, very difficult to feel empathy for another because they're so inexperienced with real reciprocal exchange that they don't really know how to have both, how to have me and how to have you. And I often say to people when they come into couples therapy, I'll say to them, you know, the ultimate question in couples therapy is, do I have to give up me to have you? Or do I have to give up you to have me? Or is there room for both of us to exist with our own experience, our own differentness? And we will experience the same events completely differently. Completely differently. And sometimes it's astonishing how differently we see things from our partner. So that experience, if we can have that in therapy, where the therapist really takes the time and makes the effort to understand what you mean when you say whatever it is you said, and really says, hold on there. I know what that means to me, but tell me what that means to you. And I'm very particular about having people define your terms. And I don't let people use metaphor. I always say metaphor is great for poetry. It's not helpful in relationship, because if we use some kind of symbolism to try and communicate how we feel, it leaves too much room for the other person's imagination. Whereas what we want is to understand that person's authenticity and not my own interpretation.
World. And for the
Such a great
therapists that, oh, I'm sorry, I
no, go ahead.
interrupted you, but
No,
and to the therapist, that was for the individuals that are about to embark in the therapeutic journey. But to the therapists that find it very, very hard, saying most of the people that suffer from trauma neglect were extremely privileged. There were probably the product of rich parents, or they had, an overload of opportunities and they went to really great schools. And to the therapists that find it really, really hard when they are dealing with someone like this, to say, how can I feel sorry for this person if they had it all? Do you think that they are then not fitted to accompany someone into unraveling the trauma of neglect?
absolutely not. And it's a great question because I certainly suffered from that myself, because I had to start working when I was 12, 11, and I had to pay for my own school. And, I had a little house cleaning business when I was 12 years old, and I would ride my bicycle up into the
Wow.
hills and clean these fancy houses and make my own money and save it up. And that's how I paid for my college. And so having these clients who were, who have histories where they had so much privilege and they went to really fancy schools and they never had to work, that was hard for me. So to answer your question, I always say this. Very, very important. This is the only other piece of advice I give. And this is not about relationship. And that is, this is for all therapists. Find the best consultation money can buy. Tell them everything and do what I'm told. So these really shameful feelings like, ugh, that makes me so angry. And believe me, I have clients who have way too much money, way too much money. And so I've had to cope with that a lot. If we have good consultation, we can sort of process our own envy and our own jealousy and our own contempt for someone who can be so ungrateful and so, still so deprived, that I can see both sides. So there will be all kinds of people that come into our offices. And if we get good consultation, we can, like in the case that you're asking, we can certainly work with that in such a way that we become very competent with those people. But it probably takes time and effort. It did for me. And I remember I had one client who, when I first started working with her, she was in graduate school, and her boyfriend, they weren't even married yet. He was supporting her. He was paying for her school. He was providing her a place to live. He was helping her with everything. And she was complaining about him all the time. And I was so appalled that she could be so ungrateful. And it took a long time before I was able to, I first of all had to manage my own stuff, and then to get her to a place where she could even see the other. Because she'd been so unseen, she couldn't even see what she was getting, let alone appreciate. So I'm really a stickler on appreciation, and consultation is essential. So we can't work with everybody, and I know there's certain clients that I'm simply not suitable to work with because I don't want to. I know that people who perpetrate child abuse need help. I'm not your person. I know that people with substance abuse addictions need help, and I'm a recovering person myself. I've been in alcohol recovery for 42 years. I'm not good in that area. I don't want to do that. So if someone comes into my office with perpetrator stuff or even fantasies, I'm not the right person. Or if somebody comes in with substance abuse or even eating disorders, they're just not my preference if I can help it. So we need to know what our categories of clients are that we prefer not to work with. But what you're describing is absolutely something that can be processed. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think it only takes people back, humbles people, especially therapists, that you're always in contact with your own story through the stories of others. Either it's directly or indirectly that you're in constant touch with. So it's humbling as a therapist, as a practitioner, always to be humbled back into trauma is a legacy that it takes a lifetime to undo. And it
That's
doesn't
true.
matter how worked through you are. They're gonna touch your buttons.
That's right. That's right. And believe me, I've been doing this work for a long time, and I still absolutely have to consult because they will hit the button and they will hit the worst one. And it's really hard.
As we know, intergenerational transmission comes in very subtle ways. One of them, I believe it's like a like a competition for suffering. Is like the suffering or the sadness of my child is never valid because he never experienced the one that I did. So hunger, you never experienced hunger, or you didn't have to work when you were 13, 14, and I was doing all this. What is the way that survivors can become more attuned to the subtle messages that come in those little phrases or behaviors? That one other example, I don't know what you think of it, but maybe this competition, this mother daughter competition that there is, you know, that the daughter will or the son will experience things that you never did, and then it becomes like a, you know, then there's subtle messages that make you feel guilty as a child, you know. But how can we become more attuned to those kind of subtle messages that are given by behaviors or by, you know, phrases?
That's a great question, and it is a hard task. And I can tell you from my own experience, my dad, and it took me many years to figure this out. My dad, I think he never quite got over the fact that he was not killed in the Holocaust. I think he had survivor guilt, and I think he somehow felt not good enough or unworthy to call himself a Holocaust survivor because he didn't die. So I had this belief that the only way to be good enough, the only way to work hard enough, the only way to whatever enough is if you die doing it, to be a martyr. And so I kind of went about my life thinking that the only way to get my father's love or to be good enough or to have virtue would be to die in the service of some noble undertaking. And so I really believed that that was my role in life, to find a way to get killed in some kind of glorious way for a cause. So that, and I wasn't even really aware of it, but I certainly put myself in harm's way. The other thing, and this is where the body becomes a real metaphor for so many things. In my case, you know, I was raised with this diatribe about, you know, hunger and suffering and deprivation, and the once again the idea that the only way to be good enough is to suffer enough, that I didn't realize what I was doing, but I started starving. And by the time I was 12, I had almost killed myself with starvation. And of course, being a child of neglect, an invisible child, no one really noticed that I was like shrinking and wasting away. They didn't even see, if you can imagine. But there's a way that I didn't know what I was doing. I had this compulsive behavior, but I was trying to be like my father by starving also, as if that would make me good enough, or that would make me enough like him, that he would love me. And of course, it didn't work. It almost killed me, but that was another goal, and that didn't work either. So all the way around, I kept failing at my objective, thank God, because ultimately I crashed really hard and I landed in therapy. And then all the rest is history. But your question of how do we keep from doing this? Well, it takes a long time to become little by little aware of all these messages that we have inherited and taken in through the intergenerational transmission, which is why it's so important for people who are parents. I'm not a parent. I knew when I was 5 that I would never be a mother because I never wanted anyone to feel like I felt. And I didn't think I could do better. And I remember I was 5 years old looking at my mother and thinking, not me, I'm not doing it. But people who are mothers, we want to help them be really aware. And there's a lot of healing that takes place in the relationship between the mother and the infant when the mother is really working on her own stuff and aware of trying to give it differently to the child than what they got. And often it's very healing for them to be on the giving end of it. It's a long road, Cynthia. It's a long road to help people with this. It's hard.
So, this trauma of neglect lives invisible wounds, as we know. They're pretty invisible. But what would be the symptoms, the main symptoms that you would see in a person that has one of these invisible wounds in them?
Well, what I have noticed as some of the signature, some of the glaring sort of signposts that point to neglect are nothing happened to me. Or, people have much worse problems than I have. I have no right, no reason to feel bad. You want to look for that because that's a flag. When people say nothing happened to me, that's probably true, and that's the problem. Nothing happened because neglect is the story of nothing. So that's one. Another one, and this I always name because I noticed it really early on, what I call the 3 P's of neglect, and they are passivity, procrastination, and paralysis. Passivity meaning they tend to be slow to initiate, and this is mostly in the interpersonal, but it can be in other ways too. Passivity meaning it's hard to initiate, it's hard to follow through and get things done. They tend to put things off. I know my husband, who is he's like the epitome of neglect. When he has a deadline, then he procrastinates, and the last night he's up all night making his deadline if he makes it. Whereas me, my first sort of my go-to is hyperarousal. I tend to overdo. When I get stressed, I do more. When he gets stressed, he starts to freeze and collapse. That's the passivity, procrastination. And the paralysis is the complete freeze where he doesn't even manage to stay up all night. He just doesn't get it done. And then he's terrified and ashamed and frozen and can't show up. He fortunately has come a long way since then, but which reminds me that most of us who have incident trauma have neglect also, because particularly if you have trauma in the family, incident trauma where something did happen in the family, it couldn't have happened if somebody was paying attention and protecting you. So there's generally neglect also. And so you want to look at a person's nervous system to get a sense of whether their primary incident trauma, which is a hyper aroused system, or if they were primary neglect trauma, which is hypo aroused nervous system. And the hypo-aroused nervous system, which they will often come in saying they have a diagnosis of ADD or ADHD, and they think that's the problem because they have something to point to instead of nothing. And it could be that it's not ADD, it's not ADHD, they don't need to be on amphetamines. they need attachment-oriented therapy and some kind of regulation therapy. So those are some of the things you can look for. The nothing happened to me, the lack of memory for anything. Some I know for myself, I had so little memory of my childhood and many of the children of neglect. I had one woman say to me, I don't remember anything about my childhood, just bushes and a little bit about the family dog.
Yeah.
So those are some of the
Wow.
clues.
When we talk about, I think those invisible wounds take away so much from a person's life, especially if they go undetected. Would you be open to sharing some of the things that you think that it took away, the wounds took away from your experience as you were developing into the beautiful woman that you are?
Hmm. Well, one question that I've learned to ask, and this goes back to your question about empathy. One question that I've learned to ask is, because there's no memory, because there's no story, and we certainly don't want to fabricate something, I ask people, so what do you know about what was going on in your mother's life when she was pregnant with you? How was the marriage? Did they have enough money? Did they have enough food? Did they intend to get pregnant? Were there any miscarriages before you? Are there older relatives or siblings that know more than you do about what was going on around her when she was pregnant with you? I have one client who he had no memory of his childhood, but he was such a exquisitely neglected character. I said, so what do you know about what was going on in your mother's life when she was pregnant with you? He said, she was in prison. I said, oh, wow.
Oh,
What for? And he said, she and my dad, they had some kind of, finance type crime together. And so they were both in prison. So I thought, wow. So here's this young couple. They get pregnant. I don't know if they intended to, but then they get separated. I don't know what the circumstances were of the arrest, which landed them both in prison, but it can't have been very harmonious between them. So then they are separate. She's in prison. She's pregnant. He doesn't even know if he was born in the prison or after she got out. But if it was after she got out, you can imagine what a person's going through when they first get out of prison and then they have their first child. So all of this is the context for what this kid is born into. And then I would ask, well, what do you know about what was going on in your mother's life when you were an infant? And he doesn't know, but you can imagine. So both parents get out of prison. They're back in some kind of home life. They're trying to reconnect. Who knows what's between them about the arrest, the time apart, having a baby. And then, boom, 10 months later, she's pregnant again. And then she has another baby. So this is all what's going on around him when he's an infant. So back to your question, what is most helpful? Well, if you get this kind of a story, and that's an extreme case, if you get this kind of a story, it gives you an idea, it gives the client an idea like, wow, that's the sort of context that I came into the world. Well, no wonder I have stuff. And then there's a certain kind of, and this is where I talk about the Bermuda Triangle. And the Bermuda Triangle is this storm of emotions which are at war inside of one person at the same time, and they all make sense. And they're anger, grief, and guilt. And I like to normalize that, and I have a diagram that goes with it. I like to normalize it because it's really hard to tolerate that all three of those emotions are going on at the same time. And they all make sense. To be so angry that that's how I made my start in this world. Like, how am I supposed to make a beginning when I come into the world that way? And terrible grief. Grief for myself. Grief for all that I've missed out on. Grief for that little child going through all that hell. Pain, sorrow, grief for the parents. Just terrible sadness. And then guilt. Guilt about the anger. I'm so angry at them, but then thinking about, well, my parents went through the Holocaust, so how can I be angry with them? They went through what they went through is so blah, 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 so much worse, which I never let people compare who has the worst.
Yeah,
So,
because I don't think there is. One personal question that I would love to hear your answer on is, I do think that the context that we have, like all the anxiety, a lot of the depression that we see rising, it is political to a certain extent. There's parenting structures, there's educational structures, there's government structures that allow for parents not to have the right environment, educators not to have the right environment, governments not to have the great structure. And that is, a byproduct of those wacky structures are children being neglected,
yeah.
And what would you think that would need to change in the current structures? Let's take one, parenting structure, for maybe children not have to grow up or grieving their developmental years.
So important, Cynthia.
Do you think we will ever see? Do you think we will ever see a world where children no longer turn up to adults that are grieving their childhoods?
I can't go on living if I don't believe that we can do better. And 1980, we got the PTSD diagnosis. And I was coming into the field in the early 80s, the middle 80s. I got my license in 1990. So I was starting to work 1988. And nobody knew anything about trauma then. And so we got the diagnosis in 1980. Nobody knew anything about it. I live on the west coast of the US, which is usually at the forefront of everything. And I had to travel to get any kind of training. There was none anywhere. And I went all over, and then I'd come back into my own community. Nobody knew anything about trauma. Nobody knew anything about the brain. Nobody was interested in any of that. So I had to work doggedly to try and both build myself up and, I was writing for a little local newspaper trying to get, some of this material out there. And it was very hard to get listened to at all. And then and so we had a few conferences in a few far apart places not near where I lived. Then in the late in the 90s, we got the decade of the brain. People started talking about the brain. And in 1995 in the US, we got this major insurance company did what they called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey. And they studied like 20,000 people to try and figure out how many people who had medical problems had some kind of what they called adverse childhood experiences like trauma, neglect, bullying, abuse, some poverty, racism. There were like 20 things on the list. That was done 1995 to 1997. Fast forward, 2024. Finally, after all these years, we've got education, we've got medical care, we've got mental health, we've got journalism, we've got mainstream general sort of thought that's trauma informed. It took forever for the world to start having a category for trauma informed. Now you hear it everywhere. Everyone's trauma informed, or they're saying that they are. And I would like to do the same with neglect, and neglect inform this world. So what that means is we have to work on every level. We have to work around the world on every level. So you're absolutely right. And I frankly believe that the reason why people could choose in my country somebody like Donald Trump to be president is because he replicates the abusive parent, or he's the protector that they never had. So they're sort of reaching for this illusion of protection or strength, or we're the best, I'm the best, and you're going to defend me. And you're absolutely right. And we've got so much murder and abandonment and loss and grief and all of it, everything you're describing, and families getting torn apart at the borders and torn apart by bombs. And oh, it's terrible in this world. So where do we begin? Well, what you're doing, which is you're getting the word out as far as you can and reaching out to people the way you reached out to me, the way you reached out to the person that I put you in touch with, that we're all doing what we can to reach more people and more sectors. We just have to work harder. And when Trump won in this country, and it's horrifying to me, I just said, well, we just have to work harder. And one of my great heroes, who, you talked about idealizing people and imaginary friends and all that, and one of mine is Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's a writer, and he said, we have to teach people, we have to teach the victim not to become a victimizer, which means working with one's own trauma so we don't traumatize others the way it was done to us. We need to break those chains. And some people have more courage than I did to have their own children and to break the chain that way. We all do what we can. And so if we're educators, if we're medical people, if we're mental health people, if we're writers, journalists, or mothers, or people, people living in the world, the more we can do to raise awareness, to trauma inform and neglect inform this world. That's the only thing I know.
And working through your own trauma. So
Absolutely.
Ideally before you have children, ideally.
Yeah. And if you haven't done it, one last thing I want to say, because I know we're getting to the end of our time today.
Yeah.
The attachment researchers, because I don't want people who are parents to feel really defeated or terrible about, what they've done or not done. And that is the attachment research people, the attachment researchers have shown that the very best of the accurately attuned mothers, the best of the best, the gold standard of accurate attunement. Get it right 30% of the time. 30%. That's less than 1/3 of the time. And the rest of the time is this dance of rupture and repair. Rupture and repair. Rupture and repair. So we have to teach people to do the repair. We have to become able to do the repair.
That's beautiful. My last question would be regarding, and I would love to know this, with everything that you know about neglect and with all the work and all those hours crying and all those hours repairing and learning how to be in relation to others without erasing yourself, what would you tell to that 12-year-old Ruth that was taking the world upon her shoulders and thinking that she had to work really, really hard on her own to make it happen?
Oh, wow. Well, way back at the very beginning of the trauma field, when we didn't have any books, we only had, I think we only had one or two books about trauma. There was one book by Bessel, which was called Psychological Trauma, a little tiny book about this thick. It's out of print now. And the other one was Judith Herman, Trauma and Recovery. And that book was like a Bible to me. And basically, both of them said in that book, in those books, and I actually, Bessel's book, The Body Keeps the Score, is such a brilliant piece of work, and it's in 42 languages around the world, and he's been on the bestseller list for almost 10 years in this country. His first book, I think, is the best thing he's ever written, and there's a chapter in there called The Attachment Cry. And Judith Herman's book, Trauma and Recovery, same thing. She talks about at the heart of any kind of trauma healing is attachment and connection to others. Everything we're trying to do depends on that. It's the hardest thing in the world for us. It's the hardest thing in the world for the survivor of trauma and neglect. It's the most important thing. It's the ground zero. So we have to learn to connect. So I always say that in order to heal from trauma and neglect, there are two essential components. They're both necessary and not sufficient. Attachment-based psychotherapy and some kind of regulation therapy, whether it be somatic therapy or brain training or something, or psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, something that changes your nervous system. So we work both sides, the nervous system and the attachment system. And both of those are essential to healing. Either one by itself is not enough.
So,
And you
what would
can
you
make
tell
it.
that little Ruth? What would you tell
And
to the little girl Ruth?
I had the good fortune of stumbling in with a good therapist on my very first try. And I always said to her, I mean, it took a while before I said this, but then I did. I said, I'm going to stay with you until you shut the door. And I did. And I stayed with her 40 years. She retired at about age 86, about 5 years ago. That's when she shut the door. And that's when I ended with her. And she always says, I raised you from a pup. She did. I would not be here today without her. So I'm grateful.
Well, thank you very much. From survivor to survivor, I'm incredibly grateful for the work you've done. I think
Well,
your
thank you,
life has
Cynthia,
been.
for inviting me. And but I want to say to your audience also that I have a special love and affinity for Latin America and Latin American people. Please, if you are able to read in English or use the material on my website, please help yourself. There's a lot to read. Get on our mailing list, and Cynthia, you can put up my website address so that people can, get on the list and get the blogs and the videos that will come out every week. I wish you all
Thank you so
really
much for
well
the
in
work
your
you've
work.
done. Thank you so
Oh,
much
well,
for the work you have done. It really does make a difference in the world. And I hope you're finally proud of yourself and knowing that you are enough.
Sometimes for a minute I am, and sometimes I still have trouble. I'll leave you with this. When I was in Oxford this last time, and I was in this really big room, and there were all these people there, the child of neglect expects, if you have any other choices, it won't be me. So here I was, and all these people were in this room, and there were people online too. And I thought, wow, they had other choices, and they came here. It's like, wow, it was sort of like, it still shocks me.
Because you're worthy and you're fabulous, and I love your work. So don't stop posting those beautiful blogs because they make me feel less alone. May you be
Oh, good.
blessed, Ruth.
Oh, good. Oh, good. So take care, Cynthia. Take care, all of you. And best of luck in your journey. Just keep with it. Stay with it. It always takes longer than we'd like. Bye for
But
now.
we'll get there.
Ciao.
Thank you,
Bye
Lee.
bye.
Minutes. Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye bye, Cynthia.
Bye bye.